Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I have kind of run out of footage of some decent longsword events to go over, especially now that we're on the eve of Helsinki Longsword Open. But this is a concept that I wanted to execute for a while now and have kind of referenced to, but I've never really executed until now. And I figured it was a good time to use some old AGO footage that I hadn't used for any other video yet. So the basic idea is this. I'm going to go through this fight exchange by exchange like I always do, only I'm going to talk about it in terms of 3 different rule sets. And the idea here is to see the various ways in an exact context how different rule sets can judge different exchanges, and perhaps importantly, whether or not these different rule sets would have changed the overall outcome of the fight. For the record, I did win this fight, though I don't really know by how much or what the AGO points would have been in this instance, and I don't really care to find out. Now, the 3 tournament rule sets I'm going to be using is, first is an Olympic fencing rule set. One where everything is 1 point and there is attack priority. And the idea here is that we're just going to take a look at whether or not there was instances where I should have defended but I didn't, or whether my opponent got the better of the attack priority or wouldn't have under this particular rule set. The second is a bog standard Nordic rule point where head and chest are 2 points regardless of cut or thrust, and arms are 1 point, and that there would be deductive after blows, meaning that if I got hit in the chest and then I hit my opponent in the arm, regardless of whether I hit first or not, my opponent would get 1 point because my 1 point hand shot would be deducted from his 2 point shot to the head. The third rule set is going to be a completely open 1 point everything but full afterblow rule set. And this is going to be a little bit different because what I want to find out is whether or not it was really the afterblows, as according to attack priority, that would have changed the fight, or point differentials, a la the Nordic rule set, that would have changed the fight. And the idea with this one is that if everything is 1 point, but all afterblows count, then maybe it's almost a semi kind of continuous rule set where the only thing that counts are clean points where you hit and did not get hit. So, with those 3 ideas in mind, let's watch a few exchanges. Our first exchange is going to be the most simple one to cover, most likely, because it is the exact same outcome in all 3 rule sets. My opponent comes forward, feints a thrust to my face, I overparry, get absolutely nothing out of it, at which point my opponent pulls off, smacks me right in the hand, and then exits range. There's only one light, 1 point, one thing that was scored, and in all 3 rule sets, my opponent is getting 1 point. They had attack priority, but lost it technically speaking, given that they pulled their initial attack and then went for the hand shot. But because I didn't hit them back, I didn't take attack priority back, so I get nothing. In the Nordic rule set, he hits me in the hands and there's no afterblow, so he only gets 1 point. And in the final everything counts rule set, there's only 1 hit, so he again just gets 1 point. And the important thing to note with exchanges like this is, actually, it's far more common than not that exchanges like this are in HEMA tournaments. People like to talk about tournaments and tournament rules a lot as having a really huge influence on the outcome of fights, but if all the exchanges are like this one, well then it really wouldn't ever matter what rule set you had, because at the end of the day, if you hit and you don't get hit, you win. For our next exchange, we are slightly more complicated, but really fairly simple as far as HEMA exchanges go. My opponent comes in, I shove their blade off to the side with a kind of beat attack, and then throw a right Zverkow to the head at the exact same time as this happens. After I have beat my opponent's blade away, they come back in on my left side, their right side, and hit me in the arms. Now, for the initial rule set of Olympic fencing style, I have priority. I have priority because despite the fact that my opponent has come forward with the initial attack, because I have initiated a blade action with my beat attack, or you could call it a parry, I have taken priority away from my opponent, and as such, when I throw my right Zverkow to the head, I maintain priority, I get my 1 point, and my opponent gets nothing, despite the fact that they have hit me in the hands. Now for a Nordic style rule set, the result is actually the same, but for completely different reasons. I parry my opponent's blade out of the way, I hit them in the head, which would get me 2 points, but because I am struck in the hands within an afterblow window by anyone's measure, my 2 points is deducted by 1, the hand shot that I received, to give me 1 point. Now, for the third rule set, there is another slight difference, but it has more to do with the fact that the open afterblow and the lack of priority rules results in both of us getting 1 point, or under some rule sets, nothing. Because under many interpretations, this is a double. However, you can see how, based on the previous two rule sets, each rule set really only deals with the existential idea of what a double really is. From the Olympic fencing standpoint, this is not a double because I did my due diligence and parried the initial attack. From the Nordic rule set difference, I did my due diligence and went for a high priority target. But in this open rule set where everything counts and nothing matters outside of who hits who, we are equal because my hit to the head is not any more valuable than my opponent's hit to the hands. So this is the first time that we have a real deviation in our rule sets. For our next exchange, we have another what you would call one light exchange. My opponent comes in, gestures with a bit of an attack. I throw an interrupting hand shot that lands right onto the hands of my opponent, and then manage to get my guard up all the way onto my right side and parry the afterblow. However, just for the sake of argument, I want to maybe look at this exchange as though it could have gone. Because on the one hand, this is just another one light exchange where every single result for all three rule sets is exactly the same. I want to imagine what would have happened if my opponent had managed to hit me in the afterblow, because this is a situation that we haven't had yet, and one in which all three results for the different rule sets will be a little bit different. So, in terms of attack priority, my opponent does come forward with an attack. However, under the rules of Olympic fencing style attack priority, I did what most people would call a counterattack. Now, the thing is that attacking into a counterattack always gives priority to the attack, but only if it lands. And if you watch carefully, what actually happens in this exchange is my opponent gestures forward with what is essentially a feinted attack. Now, if he had landed that, he would have gotten his light in Olympic fencing, but because I hit him on the hand and then don't get hit except with the follow-up, the remise attack, this means that despite the fact that I was not the first person to initiate the action, I would still have attack priority. And even if we assume that my opponent's hit toward the outside line after I had hit him in the hands had landed, I still would have kept my priority and I still would have been the only one to get a point. Now, for the Nordic style rule set, again, assuming that my opponent's afterblow did land, things would be even. I would have had a hand shot, my opponent would have had a hand shot. The deductive afterblow means he would have deducted his 1 point from my 1 point, and we would have resulted in nothing. But this is a very important distinction from the kind of thing you sometimes see where people get nothing because of an unequal double. The idea here is that sometimes if you land a hand shot, say, and your opponent hits you in the head, you can't score negative points, so the 2-point deduction just results in 0. But the important difference here is that if you are counting everything as whatever it might be, and maybe you have additive afterblows, it's actually possible that there's a rule set where my opponent who hit me in the hand simply gets 1 point at the exact same time as I get 1 point, and we end up both getting the same number of points, but that might result in a situation where one of us ends the fight. Now, moving on to the third rule set, again, assuming that we both hit each other, there's not really much to talk about because, of course, this results in both of us gaining that exact 1 point that I talked about earlier. If we go under the assumption that every single time you land something, you get credit for it, we result in this exchange being slightly more valued than it would be under a traditional deductive afterblow Nordic rule set. And while it might seem a little bit counterintuitive to give credit, more credit, to a exchange where both people hit each other at more or less the same place at the same time, the idea here is that sometimes you are in a situation where maybe you're up on points and you can delay or even end a fight by continually going for shots like this, even though you know your opponent is going to hit you. The idea being that if you can end the round in 1 point, well, then that's exactly what you're going to go for because you don't necessarily have to care what your opponent hits you back with. And the result is that despite the fact that we're trying to simulate a rule set here where everything counts, we've actually encountered a scenario where doing so results in slightly more suicidal tactics than not. Now, our next exchange is another little bit weird, but that's because of how it was called in terms of quality. And I want to kind of remove discussions about quality for this particular, thought experiment, because I think they just throw a little bit too much of a monkey wrench into the concept. So what we're going to do here is we're going to assume first that both of these techniques that each of us threw were of quality and should count. However, when watching the slow-mo, you might notice that both were more than a little bit iffy. So, upon looking at it from an Olympic fencing standpoint, What we see here is my opponent coming with an attack. If we assume that the attack is quality and I fail my parry, they hit me in the face, at which point my failed parry turns into a right Zverkow, which, again, if we're assuming it's of quality, hits my opponent in the left arm. Now, in Olympic fencing attack priority, it is pretty obvious that my opponent gets 1 point because they landed their attack. Despite the fact that I attempted to do a parry and our blades made contact, my parry was a failure based upon the idea that I didn't fully parry the attack, and it did hit me in some degree, meaning that as long as that attack is still of quality, it should count, and as such, my follow-up attack to the arm is thrown out. Now, for the Nordic rule set, what we see here is another instance of deductive afterblow. My opponent hits me in the head, I hit them in the arm, I subtract 1 point from their 2 points, resulting in 1 point. Again, the exact same result as the Olympic fencing one. However, we have another interesting interaction with the third rule set, the one where everything counts. And while this is a double, it is an uneven double. So, theoretically, if my opponent had gotten 2 points for hitting me in the head, but then my afterblow still counted afterwards, I would still get 1 point, despite the fact that I failed to parry. Again, if you're the kind of person who doesn't like anybody getting any credit for throwing an afterblow after they've already been hit, this is maybe a rule set you want to avoid rather than use. For our next exchange, we have another one where things are a little bit obvious, but I want to imagine what would happen if it was a little bit less so. In this exchange, I simply stab my opponent in the face, but I do, on the other hand, get very, very lucky in that my opponent was clearly trying to stab me back, and just through a slight fluke of edge alignment or point alignment, they don't quite make it. Now, what I want to imagine is what would happen here in these three rule sets if my opponent had just stabbed me in the face just as hard as I stabbed him. And the result, though, is going to be very, very different. Now, for attack priority in Olympic fencing, attacking is generally defined as the person who is moving forward with momentum first, either with a blade action, a hand action, or a foot action. And in all of these instances, when you slow it down to its absolute minimum, there's actually a little bit of leeway as to who you can say was initiating the attack. My opponent does seem to move forward slightly before I do, but they are not doing so with any kind of real aggression. They don't present their blade forward. They don't really look like they're trying to do an attack. They just kind of do a little bit of footwork forward. But under some rule sets, that's more than enough to be considered an attack. As such, then he would get attack priority. But the person to extend their arms first is me. And meaning that if that is what you consider an attack, I would have attack priority. Meaning that if both of us stab each other because I was the one who initiated the blade action, I would get 1 point and my opponent would get nothing. However, there is also a third version of reality here, which is that when I extend my hands, I also do a little bit of a Dirtfex, a little bit of a Contravasione. I dip my point. And there is a theoretical possibility where you could consider that a feinted attack into a follow-up attack, a remise, or maybe even a counterattack. And theoretically, if I'm doing some kind of blade action that takes away my attack priority because it's feinted, it does mean that my opponent's stab towards me happens in the exact same tempo, which means that theoretically, even under an Olympic fencing attack priority rule set, we could theoretically be called a double, 2 lights, nobody gets anything. The point I bring this up for is that Olympic fencing isn't always so cut and dry, and the concepts of attack priority have as much to do with how you define an attack as what you define a defense. And the reality is that, as you can see, there are actually 3 different ways that you can define an attack here, and 3 different outcomes for that definition. But moving on to the Nordic style rule set, it is a lot less simple. Or at least it's a lot more simple with a slightly different kind of outcome. The idea is if we both stab each other in the chest, then we both get 2 points. But there is a reality here where my opponent stabs me instead in the arm. And ironically, stabbing to the arm is never considered giving 2 points, so he might have been in a situation where he'd only deducted 1 point from my 2 points, giving me 1 point. Also, of course, if we both stab each other in the chest and we both would have gotten 2 points, in a deductive rule set, we both end up with nothing. Now, that might not seem too crazy, but that's a real big difference from the third rule set, where if we both land a 2-point thrust to the chest, we both get 2 points. And again, I have to point out that this is theoretically a fight-ending thing. if I am 2 points away from victory, or I'm up by 2 points. Stabbing somebody in the chest knowing that no matter what they do to me, they can't make up a point differential is a really big deal, because it means that I can either win the fight or delay the fight indefinitely, so long as I keep doing the same thing. Now, this is going to be the last exchange, and yes, I did skip a few, but the reason I'm ending on this one is because it is another very simple exchange that has some very important repercussions when it comes to our 3 rule sets. In terms of attack priority with Olympic fencing, it is obvious. I once again beat my opponent's blade out of the way and Zverk them in the head, which would give me my point. In a Nordic rule set, it's also very cut and dry. That I parry my opponent's blade out of the way and I Zverk them in the head and they don't hit me back, which means I get 2 clean points. And again, the result is more or less the same in the 3rd instance, where because my opponent doesn't hit me, it's a 1 light, 1 attack exchange, I get 2 points. But there is another very important thing to consider here, which is the possibility that getting 2 points for a head or chest attack can result in a very different kind of outcome depending on where you are in your fight. And this is supposed to be a difference maker between that and the Olympic fencing style rule set, not where there's attack priority, but where you get 1 point for everything. A lot of people take for granted the idea that you can get more points for going for deeper targets, but that idea is one, despite being ever present, doesn't always have a lot of very logical backing to it. Why is it that you get more points for going for deeper targets? If you go along a martial validity standpoint, you would say, well, those are more likely to kill or wound your opponent, but that's not always the most based in, medical science or real, intelligence. The idea here, though, is that if we want to have a rule set that gives us interesting exchanges, we need a different reason for why something should get 2 points versus 1 point. And in my opinion, that reason has to do with this ability right here. It is considerably more difficult and more risky, in my opinion, to go for one of these deep targets because they are further back than your opponent's hands. And as a result, that you have to do considerable more risk and put more effort into your exchange, into your attack, if you want it to land to one of those 2 targets. As a result, if we were in a situation where perhaps I was down by 1 point, but only 2 points away from winning the fight, I, at least in this particular rule set, deserve to get rewarded for hitting a difficult to hit target with 2 points, giving me the win, where in a more Olympic style fencing bout, I would have to win 2 exchanges in a row in order to make that win. And that's a really big difference. There are some rule sets that award even more than 2 points for a head or chest attack. And sometimes the differential can get so great that it becomes extremely prudent to attack these targets on their basis that if you don't, you are very, very unlikely to win the fight because you have to do 2 or 3 times more successful exchanges by hitting the hands than you would normally. For example, long point rule sets used to have the concept of the control point. This could only be achieved if you hit a head or chest target and simultaneously locked out your opponent's blade. But the point here being that being able to get 4 points when normally a hand shot could only get you 1 meant that you could often win an entire fight based on 1 or 2 control points where your opponent may or may not have been absolutely piecing apart your hands for the past 20 minutes. You could lose 7 exchanges in a row by getting hit in the hands and make up for it and win the fight with nothing but 2 control points. So this is a very important thing to consider if you're making rules, because what you have to understand is, yes, we do want to value the control point or the shot to the chest or the head, not only for martial validity reasons, but we also have to make sure that we don't give it so much value that it completely overshadows every other style of fencing. I don't think anyone is going to tell you that they'd love to just get hit in the hands 7 times in a row if it meant they had to get stabbed in the chest twice. That's just not a conversation that really pertains much to martial validity, let alone game theory. So, if you want to come to this conclusion here at the end of this video, what I want you to think about is, looking through this exchange, what you probably noticed was that 90% of the time, most of these rule sets just lined up with each other, and there really wasn't much of a difference at all. But where the differences really started to become clear was when we looked at the overall concept and the overall context of the fight as a whole. One single exchange where all 3 rule sets result in the exact same thing might make you think that using any one of the 3 rule sets are just interchangeable. But when you look at the fight as a full context, you realize that the difference between what all 3 of these rule sets would have been is the result of like 5 or 10 different points. If I got a control point for this time I stabbed my opponent in the chest, I could have won by an astronomical number of points. If all we ever got was 1 point per exchange, I might not have won at all. If we registered every single thing that landed with an infinite afterblow, or maybe had some kind of continuous fighting rule set, who knows what might have happened? It could have been that none of these blows that I threw were going to be stoppers or something like that, and my opponent could have just zverked me 6 times in the head every single time I hit him once, and it been a complete washout. The idea here is that, obviously, in my comment section, as you can probably see, there are a lot of people trying to tell me why martial validity is such a very, very important and core contextual feature for building a rule set. And what I hopefully have demonstrated here is that it just doesn't fucking have anything to do with it at all. The concept of who would die, who would live, what kinds of things we'd get sent to the hospital with, just don't produce interesting rule sets. If you tried to make one, like the 3rd rule set was, where everything counted and we, I don't know, put everything under a microscope and tried to figure out who would lose an arm and who would lose a face, you'd end up valuing certain things to a degree that you couldn't really scientifically back. And the result would be a rule set where God knows what would happen on any given exchange, and certain people would get way more credit perhaps than they deserve for certain kinds of actions, and some people will get way less than they deserve for other kinds. So, once again, if you're looking to design your own rule set, please keep these things in mind. Don't just think about what the result of a particular exchange would be. Think about how you want the context of a fight as a whole to go, and think about the kinds of fencing that you want to value versus devalue. That is the only way you're going to get the kind of fencing that you want to see. And if you want to make HEMA great and make the next great rule set that changes everything for the better, you're going to have to consider it along these options, whether you like it or not. So that is it. Pretty soon I'm going to have some Helsinki footage and I won't have to stand on the soapbox anymore. But until then, I will see you next time.